Welcome to Revenge and Justice, where betrayal finally meets its reckoning. We share powerful first-person stories of men who were underestimated, betrayed, and pushed too far by family business partners and the people they trusted most. If you believe respect must be earned and betrayal always has a price, you've found your home. And now, today's story. 18 months. That is how long it takes a son to decide his father is no longer worth listening to. 18 months and one bad afternoon in a parking lot, my knees buckling before I even understood what was happening to me. I woke up in a hospital bed with a doctor I had never met signing papers I never agreed to. By the time I understood, a judge had already stamped his name on it. Incompetent, not injured, not confused for one afternoon, incompetent permanently on paper forever, unless someone with more power than me said otherwise. My son made certain no one did. My name is Leonard Hogan. I am 68 years old. I built 6 car dealerships out of a single lot my own father lost everything trying to save. And this morning, after 547 days inside a care facility built for men who could no longer tie their own shoes, they finally opened the door and let me walk out. The Montana air hit me first. Cold, thin smelling of frost and diesel from the parking lot. I had forgotten what real air felt like. The staff had given me back my suit, the same gray one I wore the day they wheeled me in, and it hung off me now like it belonged to someone else. I had lost 22 pounds inside those walls, not from the food, from the waiting. I saw the cameras before I saw my family. 2 local news vans, a photographer crouched by the entrance, all of them tipped off, all of them positioned exactly where a good story needs its actors to stand. Then I saw Griffin. My son stepped out of a silver truck that cost more than most of my dealerships made in a slow month. He had a new watch, on the kind men wear when they need people to stop asking about their debts. He walked toward me with his arms already open, timing it perfectly for the lens behind him. He wrapped his arms around me before I could stop him. I felt his hand clap my back, too firm, too rehearsed. His mouth came close to my ear, and his voice dropped into something only I could hear. "Smile, Dad. The Vantage people are flying in Friday. If you make one scene, one single scene, I will make sure you never see the inside of that dealership again." I did not smile. I did not fight him either. I stood there like a man made of the same steel we used to frame our showroom windows, and I let him finish his performance for the cameras. Then Malaysia stepped forward, holding my grandson. She had dressed Kaysen in a little collared shirt, the kind a stylist picks, not a mother. She held him out toward me the way a woman hands over a prize she expects to be admired for. Her smile was aimed at the photographer, not at me. "Look who missed you, Leonard," she said. "Kaysen has been asking about Grandpa." I looked down at the boy. He was maybe 3 years old, blinking against the gray morning light, completely unaware he was being used as a prop in his own family's advertisement. I felt something twist behind my ribs, something old and familiar, the same ache I carried the day I buried a very different kind of paper 30 years ago. But I did not reach for him. I stepped to the side instead and walked past both of them. The cameras caught it. I heard the shutters go off, rapid, hungry. Malaysia's smile cracked at the edges before she caught herself. Griffin's jaw tightened. "Dad," he hissed, grabbing my sleeve. "What are you doing? Get in the truck. We have a lunch scheduled with the regional manager. We need this to look right." I looked down at his hand on my sleeve until he let go on his own. "You have nothing, Dad," he said, quieter now, "meant only for me. The dealerships, the land under them, all of it is mine. The court gave it to me 18 months ago. You have nothing left to threaten me with." I did not answer him. Somewhere behind the 2 of them, a security guard in a gray uniform watched the whole exchange without moving, and for 1/2 of 1 second, his eyes met mine. I did not know his name yet, but I filed away the look on his face because it was the only honest thing anyone in that parking lot had shown me all morning. There was a black sedan parked 50 yards past the news vans, old unremarkable, exactly the kind of car nobody photographs. Ronan Garner stood beside it, my lawyer for 31 years, holding the door open without a word. I walked toward it instead of the silver truck. Griffin's voice cracked behind me, rising now, no longer careful about the cameras. "Dad! Dad, get in the truck! This is not how this is supposed to go!" I did not turn around. I slid into the back seat of Ronan's car and the door closed on the sound of my son shouting my name into a cold Montana morning. Ronan pulled away from the curb. In the side mirror, I watched the silver truck, the news vans, and my son's red, furious face shrink into the distance until they were nothing but a blur against the gray sky. I closed my eyes and let out a breath I had been holding for 547 days. "I'm not done yet," I whispered. Ronan did not say a word until we had merged onto the highway. The silver truck and the news vans were gone from the mirror, now replaced by wet asphalt and the gray outline of the Continental Divide in the distance. He reached across to the passenger seat, lifted a thick folder off the leather, and passed it back to me without turning his head. It was heavier than I expected. 18 months of a company's blood pressed into paper. "The damage report," he said. "You should see it before we get anywhere near a dealership." I opened it on my knee, and my hands, still thinner than they should be, felt every page like it weighed something. The first pages were what I expected. Floor plan, credit lines maxed out on 3 of the 6 lots, the service department cut down to a skeleton crew, half the mechanics let go inside the first year, men I had trained myself, men who had put their whole careers into engines that were not even mine anymore. The employee profit-sharing account, the one I had built for 30 years, so a technician could retire with something more than a pension check drained to almost nothing. "He gutted the bonus program first," Ronan said. "Told the staff it was a temporary freeze." 18 months is not temporary, Leonard. Men who had been with you since before Griffin could drive a stick shift started quietly putting in applications at the Ford dealer across town. I turned another page and found the number that explained the rest. $2.3 million spent over 14 months on something called an immersive digital showroom. A virtual space where a customer could supposedly walk through a car lot wearing a headset instead of driving to one. "Nobody came," Ronan said flatly. "Not one sale. The whole thing folded in March." Griffin kept paying developers to patch it for another 5 months after that, hoping he could still save face with the board before anyone noticed the money was gone. I closed my eyes for a moment, and I could picture it clearly. Real mechanics standing under real fluorescent lights, losing real jobs, while somewhere in an office upstairs, my son paid strangers to build a showroom that existed nowhere at all. "And now he needs cash," I said. "That is why Vantage Minerals is flying in on Friday." Ronan's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. "The flagship lot downtown, the one your father broke ground on in 1958 with a shovel he bought secondhand, sits on top of old copper ground. Vantage wants it for lithium extraction. $42 million if Griffin signs by the end of next week." "42 million?" I repeated quietly. "He is selling the one thing that still has my father's name buried under it." "He does not know that," Ronan said. "As far as Griffin is concerned, he is just selling dirt. My father spent the last 10 years of his life fighting men who wanted that same dirt back when they called themselves the Copper Kings and bought up mineral claims from families who could not read the fine print. He lost the fight. He lost almost everything to a contract he signed, trusting a man's handshake over a lawyer's advice. I was 11 years old when the bank took our first lot, and I remember exactly what his face looked like the morning he had to tell my mother. I swore, standing in that kitchen, that no Hogan would ever again lose ground because he did not read every line of what he was signing. I looked back down at the folder, flipping past the appraisal papers, and stopped on a page of bank statements that did not belong with the rest. A single line item repeated month after month, precise to the day. $40,000 withdrawn on the 14th of every month. No invoice attached, no vendor name, nothing but a routing number leading to an account with no company listed against it. "Ronan," I said, "what is this?" He glanced at the rearview mirror, then reached back for the folder, flipping to the page himself while keeping one hand on the wheel. I watched his face change as he found it. His eyes moved down the column once, then again slower this time. "I flagged that months ago," he said. "Nobody would explain it to me. Griffin's assistant told me it was a marketing retainer. But marketing retainers do not land on the 14th of every single month for 18 months straight, rain or shine, without one invoice attached to any of it. That is not marketing. That is a schedule." He handed the folder back and kept his eyes on the road a beat too long before speaking again. "Somebody is being paid to keep something quiet," he said, "or somebody is paying to keep learning something. I have been a lawyer 31 years, Leonard. Money that moves that clean, that regular, is never advertising. It is either blackmail or maintenance, and maintenance means somebody is protecting an arrangement they cannot afford to have questioned." I looked down at the number again. $40,000 a month for 18 months, starting almost exactly the week I disappeared into that facility. Not one payment late, not one missed. "Do you know something I do not?" Ronan asked, watching me now in the mirror instead of the road. "Because I have spent 18 months trying to protect a company that no longer wanted me, returning phone calls, Leonard and I would like to know if there is a reason for that beyond your son being ashamed of you." I closed the folder slowly, and I felt the corner of my mouth lift just slightly, the way it used to when a competitor made an offer on a piece of land they had no idea I already owned. I did not answer him. The gate came into view before the building did, a chain-link barrier topped with new razor wire that had not been there 18 months ago. Ronan slowed the car to a stop in front of a guard booth painted the same navy blue as the dealership signs. A young man in a gray security uniform stepped out, clipboard in hand, breath fogging in the cold. Ronan rolled down his window. "Ronan Garner, counsel for the Hogan family. We need to get on to the flagship lot." The guard glanced past him into the back seat, and I watched recognition cross his face, followed almost instantly by something closer to alarm. He lifted the clipboard and ran a finger down a printed list. "Sir, I have a name flagged here. Leonard Hogan. Says here he is not permitted on the property without prior written authorization from Mr. Griffin Hogan." "That would be my son revoking my access to a building my own father broke ground on," I said. "You will find that harder to enforce than you think." The guard's hand moved toward the radio clipped to his shoulder. "I am going to need to call this in, sir." Ronan reached into his briefcase before the guard could lift the radio and pulled out a slim leather folder of his own, opening it to a page marked with a yellow flag. "Before you do that," he said, "I would like you to read this. It will save everyone a very cold morning standing at this gate." The guard hesitated, then stepped closer to the window and took the paper, holding it at an angle to catch the gray daylight. "That is a provision from the original Hogan Family Land Trust," Ronan said, filed the same year this lot was purchased in 1958. "It grants any living founding member of the family unrestricted access to the property for the duration of his natural life, regardless of who holds operational control of the business built on top of it. It cannot be revoked by a company memo. It cannot be revoked by anyone but a judge." The guard read it twice, his eyes moving slower the second time. I could see him doing the math, weighing a piece of paper against whatever instructions had been shouted at him that morning by someone with a much louder voice than mine. "I need to call my supervisor," he said finally, and turned toward the booth. That was when I noticed the second man, standing just inside the fence line, arms crossed against the cold, watching the whole exchange without moving. He wore the same gray uniform, older, a little more weathered at the collar, the kind of posture that came from years of standing exactly where he was told to stand. His eyes moved from the guard to the paper to me and lingered there half a second longer than they needed to. I did not know him yet, but something in the way he looked at me was not indifferent. It was careful, the way a man looks at something he has decided not to say anything about yet. The young guard came back out of the booth with his radio still in hand, his supervisor's voice crackling through it, tinny and irritated. I could not make out the words, only the tone, the sound of someone being told to handle a problem they did not want to touch. "Sir," he said, turning back to us, "my supervisor says corporate flagged you specifically. I cannot override that without something in writing from Mr. Griffin Hogan himself." Ronan opened his mouth to argue, but the older guard by the fence spoke first, his voice low and even. "Wade, he said to the younger one. "Let me see that paper." The young guard passed it over without question. The older man read it slowly, then looked up first at Ronan, then at me, holding my gaze for exactly as long as it took to make a decision. "This is a recorded trust document," he said. "County seal is right there on the corner. That outranks a corporate memo every day of the week. And if your supervisor wants to argue with a recorded deed, he can drive down here and do it himself." Wade looked uncertain, glancing between the two of them. "I have been doing this a long time," the older man said, folding the paper closed and handing it back through the window to Ronan. "I know which piece of paper wins." He stepped back and nodded once toward the gate control box mounted on the fence post. Wade hesitated another moment, then pressed the button. The gate groaned, metal scraping against metal, and began sliding open. As we pulled through, I glanced once more in the older guard's direction. He had already turned away, arms crossed again, watching the empty road behind us instead of the car passing in front of him. But just before I lost sight of him in the mirror, he looked back, and for that one instant, something passed between us that had nothing to do with the trust document at all. As we rolled past him, I caught the small brass name tag pinned crooked on his uniform. L. Bond. I turned it over once in my mind, the way I turned over every name that mattered, filing it somewhere I would not lose it. I did not know the rest of his story yet, only that a man who had just outranked his own supervisor to let a stranger through a gate was a man worth remembering. I understood the way I had understood things my whole life in this business, that not every ally introduces himself with a handshake. Ronan drove us through past the empty flagpoles and the dark windows of the showroom ahead, and I felt the cold morning air give way to something heavier. We were inside now. Whatever waited for me in that building, I was no longer standing outside looking in. The door to my old office still had the same brass handle worn smooth by 40 years of my own hand turning it every morning before the sun came up. I half expected it to stick the way it always had, the way I never got around to fixing, because I liked the small resistance, liked feeling the room push back before it let me in. It did not stick. It swung open easily, silently, on a hinge that had clearly been oiled by someone who did not know it was supposed to creak. The smell hit me before my eyes adjusted to the light. Something floral and expensive, nothing like the leather and coffee I remembered, nothing like 40 years of contracts signed under a single desk lamp. I stood in the doorway and let the room come into focus around that smell, piece by piece, until I understood what I was looking at. Ring lights on tripods stood where my filing cabinets used to be, their pale circles reflecting off a white backdrop hung across the far wall. A camera on a slider track ran the length of where my desk had sat for 4 decades. The same desk where I signed the paperwork on our first dealership loan, with my hands shaking so badly the banker had to steady the pen for me. Someone had painted over the dark wood paneling my father installed with his own hands, painted it a flat, shadowless white, the kind of white that photographs well and means nothing. This was Malaysia's studio now. I recognized the setup from the videos Kaysen wore matching outfits for the ones that ran before every dealership commercial, cheerful captions floating over footage of a family that existed only in front of a lens. She had built it here, in the one room of this building that had ever belonged entirely to me. The one room where I used to close the door and let myself be exactly as tired as I actually was. There was no chair left that I recognized, no worn spot on the carpet where I used to pace on the phone with a bank at midnight, nothing that remembered me back. A tripod stood almost exactly where I used to keep a framed photograph of Catherine on the corner of my desk, right beside the old rotary phone I refused to replace for 20 years, and for a moment, I could not decide whether that felt like an insult or simply an accident, and I was not sure which one would have hurt less. I walked further in past a rolling clothing rack of blazers still wrapped in plastic, and stopped at a stack of cardboard boxes shoved into the corner where my bookshelf used to stand. My hands moved toward the nearest box before I had decided to reach for it, the old instinct still alive in my fingers, the instinct of a man who spent 4 decades straightening his own workspace before anyone else arrived in the morning. I caught myself halfway through folding a flap closed and let my hand drop. Nobody here was waiting for the room to be tidy for me anymore. I stood there a moment longer than I meant to, looking at my own hands, as if they belonged to someone I used to know. Someone who still believed tidying a room meant he still had a place in it. I knelt down and went through the boxes anyway. Old plaques dulled with dust. A key to the city I had never once displayed because I thought the ceremony had been more for the cameras than for me. Then near the bottom of the second box, wedged against a cracked picture frame, I found the notebook. It was smaller than I remembered, the leather cover soft and dark from being carried in a coat pocket for years. Catherine's handwriting still covered every page, small and slanted, the pricing notes she used to keep on our very first used cars, back when we sat at the kitchen table figuring out what a rusted pickup was actually worth. On one page she had written next to a listing, "This one has a good engine and a liar for an owner. Do not go above 1100. And I remembered exactly which truck that was, and exactly how right she had been about the man selling it. A coffee ring stained one corner. A pressed flower had fallen loose from between two pages and lay flattened against the cardboard, gray and paper thin. The kind of thing she used to tuck away without telling me why, and I never once asked. I sat on the floor of that white, shadowless room and turned the pages slowly, one at a time, the way I had not let myself do in years. Somewhere behind my ribs, I felt the same old ache settle in, the one that had nothing to do with the studio or the boxes or the smell of perfume that did not belong in this building. It had everything to do with how easily a life gets folded into a cardboard box when nobody left in the room remembers why it mattered, and how easily a man could be folded away right alongside it. I did not let any of that show on my face. I never had. I closed the notebook carefully, ran my thumb once along the torn corner of the cover, and slid it into the inside pocket of my jacket against my chest, where it fit like it had always been meant to sit there. "Not yet, Kate," I said quietly, to no one at all in that empty white room. The building emptied out by 10 o'clock. I waited another hour after that, sitting alone in the dark of my old office with Catherine's notebook still against my chest, listening to the last set of footsteps fade down the stairwell, and the front doors locked themselves with a soft electronic click. Then I stood and I made my way to the one part of this building that no camera crew, no interior designer, and no son of mine had ever thought to touch. The stairwell behind the old parts counter still led down to the original cellar, the one my father dug out by hand the same year he broke ground on this lot, back when the building above it was nothing more than a tin roof and a hand-painted sign. Nobody used it anymore. The dealership had built a newer storage room upstairs decades ago, closer to the service bay, and this old stone cellar had been left to collect dust and forgotten inventory ever since. I flicked on a small flashlight and started down the steps, my knees protesting every one of them. The cellar smelled the way it always had, cold stone and old motor oil. A smell that took me straight back 40 years without asking permission. I crossed to the far corner, past a row of dead filing cabinets nobody had bothered to clear out, and knelt down in front of the stone floor itself. There was a single flagstone there, slightly darker than the others, cut a fraction narrower, so it sat just a hair loose in its setting. Catherine had noticed it first back when we were young and broke and storing spare parts down here ourselves. She used to joke that it looked like a door someone forgot to finish building. Neither of us ever guessed how right she was, not until the year everything with the Copper Kings finally settled, and I understood once and for all exactly what kind of protection our family would need the next time someone came looking to take this ground out from under us. I worked my fingers into the thin gap at the edge of the stone and pried it upward. It came free easier than I expected, like it had been waiting. Underneath sat a shallow steel box rusted at the corners, exactly where I had placed it 30 years ago on a quiet Sunday afternoon while Griffin was at a birthday party 3 streets over and had no idea his father was burying anything at all. I lifted the box out and set it on the stone floor in front of me. My hands, I noticed, were not shaking anymore. Not the way they had been at the care facility. Not the way they had been in the back of Ronan's car. They were steady now. the way they used to be before a big closing, the way a man's hands go still right before he finally gets to do the one thing he has been waiting a very long time to do. I opened the lid. The flashlight beam caught the edge of a folded document inside its paper, gone soft and yellow at the corners. For a long moment, I did not move at all. I only knelt there in the cold, listening to my own breath fill the empty cellar. The beam of light trembling slightly against the stone wall. The only sound, the faint tick of the cellar pipes settling somewhere above my head. Catherine had been the one to insist we file it separately from everything else, back when the lawyer we hired thought we were being paranoid. Mineral rights severed clean from the surface deed registered under a family holding neither of us ever spoke about again once the paperwork was done. She sat across from me at our kitchen table the night we signed it, still in her work apron, flowers still dusted on her forearm from the bread she had left rising on the counter, and she told me that a man who has already lost everything once knows better than anyone what is worth protecting twice. I remember asking her if she thought I was being foolish, hiding something from my own future son before he was even born, and she looked at me for a long moment before she answered. She said, "A father does not hide things from his children. He simply decides which truths a child is old enough to be trusted with, and waits." I never told Griffin. I never told anyone but Ronan years later. And even then, only that the document existed, never where. I told myself I was protecting him from having to carry the weight of it. I understand now, kneeling on the same cold stone 30 years later, that I was protecting myself from ever having to explain why I did not trust him to carry it at all. I lifted the deed out of the box and unfolded it under the flashlight, reading words I had not laid eyes on in 3 decades. Severed mineral estate. Reserved in perpetuity. Every syllable exactly where I remembered leaving it. Vantage Minerals could offer my son $42 million for dirt he did not fully own. He could sign every page of that contract with a smile for the cameras. But the copper, the lithium, everything underneath the ground he thought was his to sell had belonged to me since before he was old enough to understand what a signature meant. I folded the deed back along its original creases and pressed it flat against my palm. Griffin can sell the shell I whispered into the dark cellar, but the core is still mine. The knock on my hotel room door came at 7 the next morning, sharper and more impatient than it needed to be. It was one of Griffin's assistants, a young man I did not recognize, holding a phone against his ear with one hand and gesturing for me to follow with the other, as if I were an appointment he was already running late for. "Mr. Hogan wants to see you before the launch event tonight," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. He said it would only take a minute. Griffin's new office sat on the top floor of the flagship building, the one that used to be a conference room before he decided he needed something grander than the one I had used for 40 years. The elevator ride up took longer than I remembered, or perhaps I simply noticed it more now, counting the floors the way a man counts things when he has nothing else to do with his hands. Floor-to-ceiling glass looked out over the lot, over rows of vehicles gleaming under a gray Montana sky, arranged in perfect rows the way Griffin had always preferred them, form over function, image over inventory turnover. He was standing behind a desk twice the size he needed, scrolling through something on his phone, and he did not look up right away when I walked in. "Dad," he said, finally setting the phone down and spreading his arms in a gesture that was clearly meant for the assistant, still hovering by the door, not for me. Come in. I wanted to talk to you before tonight." I stood across the desk from him and said nothing, waiting to see what performance this was going to be. "I know things have been tense," he said, his voice pitched slightly louder than the room required, the way a man talks when he wants the words overheard rather than simply heard. "I want you to know I am not trying to leave you with nothing. I know the court gave me full control, but you are still my father." He reached into a drawer and produced a small plastic card, sliding it across the desk toward me with 2 fingers. The way a man tips a valet he does not particularly respect. "It is a prepaid card," he said. $500 a month reloads automatically, enough for groceries, gas, whatever you need. "I did not have to do this, Dad. I want you to remember that I did not have to do this." The assistant by the door shifted his weight and glanced at me, and I understood then exactly what this moment was for. It was not a gift. It was a performance for an audience of one witness, staged so that somewhere down the line, if anyone ever asked Griffin, could say he had taken care of his father, that he had been generous even after everything, that whatever came next was not his fault. I picked up the card. It was lighter than I expected. The plastic thin and cheap, nothing like the heavy embossed cards I used to carry when this company still bore my signature on every account. I turned it over once in my hand, reading the small print on the back. The daily withdrawal limit, printed in a font too small for a man my age to read comfortably without squinting. I did not squint. I did not let my face show anything at all. I set the card down flat on my palm and studied it for exactly 3 seconds, no longer, the same 3 seconds I used to give a lowball offer before deciding whether to walk away from a negotiating table or sit back down. Then I slid it into my pocket without a word, my hand steady, my shoulders loose, my face arranged into the pleasant blankness of a man who has nowhere better to be. "Thank you, son," I said. "This is very generous of you." Griffin's eyes flickered just slightly, like he had expected more resistance and did not quite know what to do with the absence of it. He recovered quickly, straightening his jacket, glancing at the assistant as if to confirm the moment had gone the way he intended. "Tonight is important," he said, his tone shifting back into business. "The launch event, the new electric lineup, half the regional press will be there. I would prefer if you kept a low profile. Nothing dramatic, just let me have this one night, Dad." I slid the card into my breast pocket next to Catherine's notebook, the two of them sitting together against my chest like something and its opposite. "Of course," I said. "I would not dream of taking anything away from you tonight." He studied me for a moment, searching my face for the argument he had clearly braced himself for, the outburst that would let him call security and have a story ready for the board about his father's continuing instability. He did not find it. I made certain he would not find it. I turned and walked out of his glass office without another word, past the assistant, past the rows of gleaming vehicles reflected in the windows behind me, each one polished to a shine I used to insist on myself back when a customer's first impression of a lot meant more to me than any commission. I let the elevator doors close before I allowed myself even the smallest breath. $500 a month, I thought, riding down alone, watching the floor numbers count backward toward the lobby. The price of his arrogance dressed up as generosity, and he does not even know it yet. By the time the doors opened again, my face had already settled back into the same calm I had worn walking in, and nobody standing in that lobby would have guessed I was carrying a folded deed against my chest worth more than every vehicle on that lot combined. I found Morgan Green where I expected to find him, in the service bay behind the flagship showroom, elbow deep in the engine of a trade-in nobody had bothered to inspect properly. He had run that department for 11 years, since long before Griffin ever set foot on the sales floor, and his hands still moved with the same unhurried certainty I remembered. The certainty of a man who trusts his own judgment more than any diagnostic computer. He straightened up when he saw me, wiping his hands on a shop rag, and for a moment neither of us said anything at all. Then he set the rag down on the fender and crossed the bay toward me, and I watched something shift in his face. Relief mixed with a wariness that told me exactly how carefully he had been watching which way the wind was blowing since I disappeared. "They told us you were not coming back," he said. "They told a lot of people a lot of things," I said. "I am asking you now the way I asked you 20 years ago when your daughter needed that knee surgery and the insurance company said no. I am asking you to trust me on something, and I am not going to be able to explain all of it up front." Morgan glanced past me toward the empty bay doors, then back at my face, and I saw him make the same calculation I had made 100 times myself, weighing loyalty against risk, weighing the past against whatever was coming next. "My daughter still walks on that knee without a limp," he said finally, mostly to himself. "Griffin does not know that story. He was not around for it. He never asked why I stayed on this floor 11 years when 3 other dealerships in this county offered me more money to leave. What do you need?" he said. "I need into Griffin's office tonight, after the cleaning crew finishes," I said. "I need something small, placed where it will not be found. And I need you to understand that if anyone ever asks you, we're never there." He did not ask what the device was for. He did not need to. He simply nodded once, the same nod he used to give me across a service counter when a difficult customer finally agreed to a fair price, and told me the cleaning crew cleared out by 9, that he still had a master key from his years running the night shift, and that Griffin's new security system had a blind spot in the stairwell camera nobody upstairs had bothered fixing since it went in. We went up together a few hours later, the building dark and quiet around us, our footsteps softened by the same carpet Malaysia had installed to replace the hardwood my father once laid down himself. Morgan led us into Griffin's office with his old key, the lock giving way with a small mechanical sigh, and I stood in the doorway a moment while he crossed to the desk and knelt down beneath it. The small recording device already in his palm, he worked in silence, his fingers moving with the same careful patience he used to bring to a stubborn transmission, feeling along the underside of the desk for a place to press the device flat against the wood. Then his hand stopped moving. "What is it?" I asked. He did not answer right away. He pulled his hand back slowly, and in it, pinched between 2 fingers, was a second device, smaller than the one he was holding. Matte black, already fixed in place with adhesive gone slightly yellow at the edges with age. "This one was already here," he said quietly. I crossed the room and knelt beside him, taking the small device from his hand and turning it over under the glow of my flashlight. It was not the kind of thing a private investigator picks up at a hardware store. The casing was too precise, the antenna too well hidden. The kind of equipment that costs real money and belongs to people who do this professionally, people with a reason to know exactly what gets said inside a CEO's office and precisely when it gets said. "How long has this been here?" Morgan asked, still crouched beneath the desk, his voice lower now. "I do not know," I said, turning the device slowly in my fingers, watching the small, dull gleam of it catch the flashlight beam. "But it has not been catching dust the way the rest of this room has. Somebody has been maintaining it." Morgan looked up at me from the floor, and for the first time since I had walked into that service bay, I saw real unease cross his face. The look of a man who had agreed to plant one secret, only to discover he had walked into someone else's much larger one. "Vantage Minerals wants this land badly enough to buy it," I said quietly, setting the strange device down on the carpet between us. "Badly enough it seems to already know exactly how desperate my son is to sell it." I placed our own device where Morgan had originally intended, careful not to disturb the other one, and we backed out of that dark office the same way we had come in, saying nothing until the stairwell door closed behind us. "Somebody has been here before us," I said once we were clear of the camera's blind spot, my voice barely above the hum of the building's ventilation. "And whoever it is, they have been listening a lot longer than we have." The showroom floor had been cleared of vehicles and refitted for the evening white cocktail tables scattered across polished concrete, a string quartet tuning up near the service bay doors that Morgan and I had walked through the night before. Strings of warm light hung overhead, expensive enough to make the whole room look like something out of a catalog rather than the dealership I had built with a single loan and a handshake. I counted perhaps 60 guests already circulating by the time I arrived. Regional press with cameras slung over their shoulders, a scattering of investors in tailored jackets, all of them here to see Griffin unveil the electric lineup he had promised would save this company. A banner overhead read, "The future arrives tonight." The letters lit up in the same cold blue as the ring lights upstairs, in what used to be my office. I had not been invited. I walked in anyway, through the same side entrance Morgan had shown me, and found a spot near the back where the light was dimmer and fewer people thought to look. Griffin stood at the center of the room near a covered vehicle draped in white fabric, laughing too loudly at something a man in a navy suit had said, his hand resting on the man's shoulder, in the practiced way of someone who had learned charisma from a seminar rather than a lifetime of actually earning trust. I recognized the type of man he was talking to immediately, the careful posture, the watch too subtle to be anything but expensive, the particular stillness of someone whose job was to notice everything and reveal nothing. I made my way toward them slowly, pausing to accept a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray, listening more than moving. Griffin has always had a gift for vision, the man in the navy suit was saying to another guest as I drew closer. Forward thinking. Not every dealership owner would have the courage to invest in digital retail infrastructure this early. I stepped into the small circle of conversation before anyone could stop me extending my hand toward the man in navy. "Leonard Hogan," I said. "Griffin's father." I could not help overhearing. "You must be talking about the immersive showroom project." The man's expression shifted curiosity, replacing polite indifference. "That is right," he said. "I understand it was quite an undertaking. Cutting-edge technology." "It certainly was expensive technology," I said, keeping my voice light, almost admiring. $2.3 million is a serious commitment for a company our size. I have always found the return on an investment like that tells you more about its value than the ambition behind it. Has anyone mentioned what the final sales figures came out to be? The silence that followed lasted only a second, but I watched it land exactly where I wanted it to. The man in navy glanced toward Griffin, who had gone slightly pale near the covered vehicle, his laugh from a moment ago already forgotten. Another guest nearby, a woman I did not recognize with a lanyard identifying her as a regional credit analyst, had gone very quiet as well, her eyes moving between me and Griffin with the particular attention of someone recalculating a number in her head. "I am not certain I have seen a report on that," the investor said carefully. "Neither had I until this week," I said, and smiled, and took a small sip of the sparkling water, and let the silence do the rest of the work for me. Griffin excused himself abruptly from his own conversation and started making his way across the room toward us, weaving between cocktail tables with a speed that did not match the easy smile he was trying to keep pasted on his face. But Malaysia reached me first. She appeared at my elbow in a dress the color of dried blood, her hand closing around my forearm with a grip far stronger than the smile on her face suggested, and steered me firmly toward the far corner of the room, away from the string quartet, away from the cluster of investors still murmuring among themselves. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" she said quietly, her voice pitched low enough that no camera in the room would ever pick it up, her smile still fixed and perfect for anyone watching from a distance. "I am simply admiring my son's new lineup," I said. "You are humiliating him in front of the one investor who still believes his numbers," she said, her fingers tightening slightly on my arm. "You had your gate open for you this morning. Do not mistake generosity for permission, Leonard. There are far worse places for an old man with your history to end up than a care facility with clean sheets and regular meals. I could have that arranged again with one phone call, and this time there would be no life estate clause, no clever lawyer, nobody standing outside a gate to argue on your behalf." I looked down at her hand on my arm until, much like Griffin 2 days earlier, she remembered herself and let go. "I have already seen the worst place you people know how to put me," I said quietly. "I do not frighten as easily as I used to, and I have spent 18 months learning exactly how patient a man can become when he has nothing left to lose and nowhere he needs to be." Her smile did not waver, but something behind her eyes went very still, calculating, recalibrating, the look of a woman deciding exactly how much of a problem I had just become. I did not sleep that night. Not that I expected to. I sat in the armchair of my rented room with the small receiver Morgan had given me resting in my palm, the earpiece cold against my skin, and waited until the hour I knew Griffin usually poured his second drink of the evening. The room around me was quiet in the particular way rented rooms always are, no clock ticking, no furnace settling, nothing but my own breathing, and the faint hiss of the receiver waiting for a signal. At 11 o'clock exactly, the feed crackled to life. The audio was rougher than I expected, thin around the edges, catching the hum of the building's heating system before it caught anything human. Then I heard the clink of ice against glass, and Griffin's voice, already loosened by whatever he had already finished before that second pour. "She embarrassed me tonight, Tiff," he said. "In front of Callahan, in front of the credit woman. My own father standing there asking about numbers he has no business asking about." Malaysia's voice came through, clearer, sharper, none of the softness she performed so well in public. "He is guessing Griffin. He does not have access to anything. Stop drinking and think for 1 minute instead of feeling sorry for yourself. I closed my eyes and let the voices settle into the dark room around me, the way I used to sit in board meetings and let two executives argue themselves into revealing more than either of them intended. "I need liquidity before Friday," Griffin said, his words starting to slide together. "Vantage is not going to wait forever, and if that deal falls through because my own father made me look unstable in front of half the regional press, I do not know what we do next." There was a pause, the sound of a chair creaking, footsteps crossing a hard floor. Speaking of before Friday, Malaysia said, her tone shifting into something colder and far more businesslike. "I need $50,000 by the end of the week, the usual account." I need what Griffin said. And I could hear the exact moment his voice cracked open with panic. "I already send that every month, Tiff. 40,000 every single month like clockwork. What is 50 more for?" Nanny needs a raise if she is going to keep her mouth shut about the schedule discrepancies, Malaysia said. And Kaysen needs a new pediatrician, one who does not ask questions about certain paperwork. Consider it the cost of doing business. I sat forward slightly in the chair, every muscle in my body suddenly very still, listening to a number I had already seen once on a bank statement in the back of Ronan's car, finally attached to a reason, even if the reason itself was still wrapped in half-truths and evasions. "You are bleeding me dry," Griffin said, his voice smaller now, almost pleading. "I do not have $50,000 sitting around, Tiff. Not with the payment due on the Vantage Bridge loan, too. I am doing everything you asked. I sold the boat. I put a second mortgage on the lake house you wanted. What more do you want from me?" "Then find it," Malaysia said, her tone flat, unmoved by any of it. "Sell something, or I take Kaysen and I go stay with my sister until this whole mess with your father blows over and you can explain to the board exactly why your wife left with your son 3 days before the biggest deal of your career." For a moment the line dissolved into static, a rough burst of interference that swallowed several seconds of whatever Griffin said next. The same kind of static I had heard once already in the car with Morgan's spare receiver, brief, deliberate sounding, gone as quickly as it arrived. I pressed the earpiece tighter against my skull, straining for whatever had been lost underneath that noise, but by the time the signal cleared, Griffin's voice had already dropped too low to make out clearly, and Malaysia's had turned soft again, coaxing the voice she used for cameras and investors alike. "Do not make this harder than it needs to be," she was saying, when the words finally came back into focus. "You promised me a life, Griffin. I intend to collect on that promise one way or another." I sat with the earpiece still pressed against my skull long after their voices had faded into the sound of a closing door somewhere on the recording, long after the feed settled back into the low electronic hum of an empty office. I did not move. I did not reach for the notebook against my chest, or the folded deed still hidden beneath the floorboard of my rented room, or anything at all. 40,000 a month, now asking for 50,000 more, and somewhere underneath all of it, a boy, not yet 4 years old, being weighed against a bank transfer like a line item on a balance sheet. I thought of Kaysen's small collared shirt at the care facility gate, chosen by a stylist and not a mother, and I understood now, with a clarity that turned my stomach, exactly why that detail had bothered me from the very first moment I saw it. I simply sat there in the dark, turning over every word I had just heard, until the receiver grew warm in my hand and the first gray light of morning had already begun to creep along the edge of the window. And even then I did not move and I did not speak, and I did not let myself decide yet what any of it actually meant. I could not stay in that rented room a moment longer once the sun came up, so I spent the day doing nothing that mattered, walking the length of Uptown Butte twice just to feel my legs remember how to carry me somewhere without a destination, and returned to the flagship building well after midnight, telling the night guard, not Luke Bond this time, but another man on a different shift, that I had simply forgotten something in storage. He let me through without much interest. Grief and old age make convenient excuses, and I have never minded using them when they serve a purpose. I climbed the stairs to my old office, intending only to sit there a while in the dark, the way a man returns to a church long after he has stopped believing anything happens inside it. The hallway lights were off, the building settled into the particular stillness that only comes after every last employee has gone home. but there was already a thin line of light showing beneath the door. I pushed it open slowly and found Malaysia kneeling on the floor in front of the wall where Catherine's portrait used to hang. A section of white paneling swung open on a hinge to reveal the small steel safe my father had installed behind it decades before either of us was born. Her hair had come loose from whatever style she had worn earlier in the day, and she was working a small flashlight between her teeth while both hands turned the dial over and over. Numbers I recognized even from across the room, because I had chosen most of them myself 30 years ago, before she ever existed to me. She heard the door and spun around so fast the flashlight clattered to the floor, rolling until it came to rest against a box of old plaques I had left half-sorted 2 nights earlier. "Looking for something?" I asked. She recovered faster than Griffin ever managed to, straightening to her full height, smoothing her hair back with one hand, as though that alone could erase what I had just watched her do. "I could not sleep," she said. "I remembered Catherine used to keep some old jewelry in here, sentimental things. I thought Kaysen might like to have them someday." "You are 3 numbers into my late wife's birthday," I said. "That is not a combination anyone finds by accident, and it is not one you would know unless somebody told you exactly where to start." "Maybe I asked Griffin," she said, her chin lifting, slightly defiant now instead of startled. "He grew up in this office. He would remember things like that." Griffin has never once in his life remembered his own mother's birthday without a reminder on his phone, I said. "You will need a better story than that one." Her eyes flicked just briefly toward the boxes stacked against the far wall, the same boxes I had gone through 2 nights before. And I watched something shift behind her expression, quick and unmistakable. The look of a woman realizing the room had already been searched by someone else before she ever set foot in it. "Someone has been through these," she said quietly, more to herself than to me, crouching briefly to check the flaps of the nearest box, the ones I had folded closed the way I always folded things, corners squared, nothing left hanging loose. "That was not for you to find either," I said. She stood back up slowly, and for the first time since I had known her, I watched real uncertainty cross her face, not performed, not aimed at an audience, just a woman doing arithmetic she did not like the answer to. "What exactly do you think you know, Leonard?" She said, her voice quieter now, stripped of its usual practiced warmth. "I know enough to recognize when someone is looking for something they are afraid somebody else already found," I said. "I have not decided yet whether that makes you desperate or simply careless. Possibly both." She gathered herself, closed the safe panel with a soft click, and walked past me toward the door without another word, her heels striking the floor harder than necessary. The sound of a woman recalculating everything she thought she understood about how much time she had left to work with. I did not sleep again that night either. At 6 the following morning, my phone rang and Ronan's voice came through tight and fast before I had even finished saying hello. "Leonard," he said, "Vantage just moved the signing. Whatever their concern was, somebody spooked them into wanting this done sooner rather than later. It is not next week anymore. It is Friday, 2 days from now." I stood by the window of my rented room, the phone still pressed to my ear long after Ronan had already said everything there was to say, watching the gray Montana light climb slowly over the rooftops across the street. Somewhere below, a delivery truck idled at a red light, its engine the only sound in an otherwise silent morning. A pigeon settled on the ledge outside the glass, shifted its weight twice, and flew off again toward the water tower on the hill. The radiator in the corner of the room ticked once, then went quiet. I did not speak. I simply stood there, the phone growing warm against my ear, letting the numbers settle into my chest, the way cold water settles into a wound, understanding for the first time since I walked out of that care facility exactly how little room I now had left to move. The address Ronan gave me led to a stretch of Anaconda I did not recognize, a row of low metal buildings 20 minutes outside Butte, where the rent was cheaper and the customers asked fewer questions about a woman's last name. Solus Auto Repair sat at the end of the row, a single-bay garage with a hand-painted sign and a gravel lot instead of asphalt, a single string of Christmas lights still hanging along the eave from some holiday long past, half the bulbs burned out. I parked across the street and sat there a moment, running through what I intended to say, though I already knew from long experience that the words a man rehearses rarely survive contact with an actual conversation. She was under the hood of a pickup when I walked in, a socket wrench in one gloved hand, and she straightened up the moment the bell over the door announced me, wiping grease from her fingers onto a rag tucked into her coveralls. Recognition crossed her face almost instantly, followed by something harder, something that looked very much like a door closing before I had even finished stepping through, the one made of glass. "You need to leave," she said, before I had said a word. "I am not here to cause trouble," I said. "I am here because I think you and I have both been lied about by the same two people, and I think it is possible we could be useful to each other." She set the wrench down on a workbench with more force than the task required. "My son is finally sleeping through the night again," she said. "Do you have any idea how long it took to undo what your family did to us? I am not interested in getting anywhere near that mess again for any reason, especially not with the man everyone in this county thinks put his own daughter-in-law in the hospital." "I did not put anyone in a hospital," I said quietly. "I have never once raised a hand to a member of my family, and I think somewhere underneath everything Griffin and Malaysia told you, you already suspect that is true." She reached for the garage door control mounted on the wall, her thumb hovering over the button. And for a moment, I genuinely believed she intended to close it in my face and end the conversation there. "Give me one reason," she said. "I have spent the last 2 years finding out exactly how Malaysia operates," I said. "The staged accidents, the manufactured evidence, the way she isolates a person from anyone who might believe them right before she destroys their credibility completely. I do not know the details of what happened to your marriage, Alina, but I would wager a great deal that it followed a very familiar pattern." Her thumb stayed on the button, but she did not press it. Something in her face had shifted, the wariness still there but joined now by a kind of exhausted recognition, the look of a woman who had spent a long time being told her own memory could not be trusted. "There was a hotel room," she said, finally, her voice flat rehearsed from having explained it too many times to people who did not believe her. "A man I had never met before, a photographer who happened to be there at exactly the right moment. Griffin had divorce papers ready before I even finished explaining that I had been set up. He said Beckham probably was not even his. We lived out of my sister's spare bedroom for 3 months. "I know," I said, "and I believe you. I did not come here to relitigate what happened to your marriage. I came because I am rebuilding something, and I am going to need people around me who cannot be bought, cannot be threatened, and have absolutely no reason to protect Griffin or Malaysia's version of events." "What exactly are you asking me to do?" she said. "Testify, eventually, if it comes to that," I said. "And before that, help me understand the parts of this company Griffin has tried hardest to hide. When this is finished, I intend to run Hogan Premier Auto the way it should have been run all along, and I intend to have someone I trust running operations alongside me, someone who already knows exactly what it costs to be underestimated by that family." She studied me for a long moment, arms crossed now, grease still smudged along one forearm. And I saw in her posture something I recognized immediately. A version of the same careful stillness I had spent 18 months learning myself. The stillness of a person who has been burned badly enough to distrust even the offer of help. I did not say anything about that recognition. I only let her look at me as long as she needed to. "You expect me to just trust you?" she said. "Based on what? A story about a woman I have never even met doing something similar to me?" "I am not asking you to trust me yet," I said. "I am asking you to hear me out completely once before you decide." She was quiet for a long moment, glancing back toward the pickup she had been working on, toward the small office at the rear of the garage, where I could see a child's drawing taped crookedly to the wall. "I need to know what you actually want, Leonard," she said finally. "Not just revenge. I have seen what revenge does to people in this family. I need to know what you actually want. I want what is left of my family back on solid ground before I run out of years to enjoy it," I said. "I want the people who did this held accountable in a way that cannot be bought off or explained away. And I want my grandson to grow up knowing his grandfather did not simply disappear because it was convenient for everyone else. That is what I actually want, Alina. Nothing more theatrical than that." She studied me for a long moment, and something in her shoulders finally loosened the tight, defensive posture she had held since I walked through her door, easing just slightly enough that she pulled a stool out from beside the workbench and sat down on it, gesturing for me to take the folding chair across from her. "It was not just some stranger Griffin found," she said, picking up where my answer had apparently earned her trust to continue. "I found that out later, piecing it together myself, because nobody would tell me outright. Malaysia arranged the entire thing. She hired the man. She paid the photographer to be in that hallway at exactly the right time. She had been circling Griffin for months before any of it happened, and the only thing standing in her way was me." I sat very still, letting her find the rhythm of a story she had clearly told herself 100 times in the dark, alone, long before she ever said it out loud to another living person. Her voice steady in the way of someone who has rehearsed steadiness, because the alternative felt too dangerous to allow. "I did not even know his name," she said. "The man in that hotel room. I went there because Malaysia called me herself, pretending to be a caterer, saying there was an emergency with the vendor for Griffin's company retreat, and that Griffin needed me to meet someone there immediately. I walked in expecting a seating chart. Instead, there was a stranger, and before I could even ask what was happening, he had his hand on my arm, and the door to the closet was already opening, and the flash was already going off." I did not understand what had actually happened to me until months later, when a private investigator I hired with money I did not really have traced the photographer's invoice back to an account registered under a name that eventually led to Malaysia's own sister. Her hands had curled into fists on her knees, the knuckles pale under the grease still staining her skin. "Griffin did not ask me one single question," she said. "Not one. He had the divorce papers drawn up within 48 hours. He told the family court mediator I was unstable, that I had a history of erratic behavior, that he was concerned for Beckham's safety. None of it was true, but Malaysia had already built the story for him, complete with fabricated text messages and a therapist note she somehow acquired that was never actually written about me. I lost primary custody for almost a year," she said, her voice beginning to fracture at the edges, now the practiced flatness finally giving way. "A year. Leonard Beckham was 4 years old. He started calling the nanny Mama because I only got him every other weekend, and by the time my lawyer finally proved the whole thing had been staged, that year was already gone. I do not get it back. Nobody gives you that year back. I missed his first day of preschool. I missed him losing his first tooth. I found out about both of those things from a text message Griffin sent, almost a week after they happened, like an afterthought, like he was updating a business contact instead of the mother of his son." She wiped roughly at her eyes with the back of one wrist, leaving a faint smear of grease along her cheekbone, and did not seem to notice or care. "I am sorry," I said quietly. "I mean that plainly. I am sorry that happened to you, and I am sorry it took me this long to be standing in this garage instead of somewhere useful 18 months ago." She let out a short, unsteady breath that was not quite a laugh. "You could not have stopped it," she said. "You were already gone then." "Maybe not," I said, "but I can help make sure it never happens to anyone else in that family again. And I can help make sure the two of you finally answer for what it cost you and me both." She was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her own hands at the grease worked permanently into the lines of her knuckles from years of honest work in a business her ex-husband's company would never have hired her to run. "If I do this," she said finally, looking up at me directly, "I need it to actually mean something. Not just headlines, not just satisfaction for you. I need Beckham to grow up somewhere that Griffin and Malaysia cannot touch, and I need people to finally believe me instead of just feeling sorry for me." "I can promise you both of those things," I said. She held my gaze a moment longer, then nodded once, slow and deliberate, the same gesture I imagined she used when she finally trusted a diagnosis on an engine nobody else could figure out. Outside, the light through the garage windows had shifted toward late afternoon, throwing long shadows across the concrete floor between us. "Then I will testify," she said. "Whatever you need. I am done being the quiet one in this story." Ronan and I split the list between us that same afternoon. 6 franchise partners scattered across 2 counties, each one a small independent dealership operating under the Hogan Premier Auto name, and paying a percentage of every sale back to whatever entity controlled the parent company. I took the 4 closest to Butte myself, driving from lot to lot with a folder of proxy authorization forms on the passenger seat, watching the gray afternoon light shorten with every stop as Friday crept steadily closer. The first partner, a man named Everett, who had run his lot since before Griffin could legally drive, came around his desk the moment he recognized me and gripped my hand with both of his, saying nothing for a long moment, his eyes bright and unsteady. Bright and unsteady. "I heard you were not coming back," he finally managed. "I want you to know I never believed a word of what they said about you, not one word." He signed the proxy before I even finished explaining what it was for. The second and third stops went nearly the same way. Careful conversations over cups of bad coffee, old loyalty resurfacing faster than I expected, once people understood exactly what Griffin had been doing with the company in my absence. Exactly how close he had come to selling the ground out from under all of them, without so much as a phone call of warning. By the time I reached the 4th lot, I had 4 signed proxies in my folder, representing enough combined voting weight to give me real leverage in any emergency board session Ronan could force into being before Friday. The last stop of the day was Braylon Singleton's dealership in Anaconda, the smallest of the 6. A modest lot with a dozen used vehicles and a service bay that clearly ran on Braylon's own labor more often than not. A hand-lettered sign in the window advertised a Christmas layaway program for families who could not manage a full down payment, the kind of thing corporate had tried to discourage for years because it did not look polished enough for the brand. He met me in the small front office, a heavy-set man in his 50s with tired eyes and a handshake that lingered a beat longer than politeness required. "I always liked doing business with you, Leonard," he said, settling into the chair behind his desk, the springs creaking under him in a way that suggested the chair had seen better decades. "Your son, no offense, has never once returned one of my calls in 18 months. I have been running this place on faith and old inventory ever since he took over." I explained the proxy the same way I had explained it 4 times already that day, watching him nod along, watching the particular tension in his shoulders that told me this was a man carrying more financial worry than he wanted anyone to see. He signed without much hesitation, sliding the paper back across the desk toward me. "Whatever you need, Leonard," he said, signing his full name with a slow, deliberate hand. "I trust you. I always have." I thanked him, gathered the folder, and drove back toward Butte as the last gray light gave way to evening. Satisfied with the day's work in a way I had not allowed myself to feel in 18 months. I had barely settled into the chair of my rented room, folder still in hand, when my phone rang, an unfamiliar number with an Anaconda area code. Leonard Braylon's voice came through thin and shaking in a way it had not been 3 hours earlier. "I need you to tear up that proxy. I'm sorry. I need you to forget I ever signed it." I sat forward slowly. "What happened, Braylon?" "A woman called me 20 minutes ago," he said. "Did not give her name. Did not need to. She knew things about my dealership's financing that only somebody with access to Vantage Minerals' own paperwork could possibly know. She knew about the second loan I took out against this lot 2 years ago that I have never told a soul about, not even my wife. She said if my name stays on that proxy, she will make certain every bank in this county knows exactly how far underwater I actually am before the week is out. She said it in that soft voice people use when they want you to know they could destroy you and still smile for a photograph afterward. My hand tightened around the phone. "Braylon," I said, "that is a threat, not a fact. I can help you. Whatever difficulty you are in with that loan, there are ways to manage it that do not involve handing this woman exactly what she wants. You cannot help me lose this dealership faster than she already can," he said, his voice cracking now, raw with something close to panic. "I have a family, Leonard. I cannot afford to be the man who stood up to Malaysia Walker and lost everything doing it. I have 3 kids and a wife who does not know the second mortgage exists. And if that gets out before I can fix it quietly, It will not just be my business that falls apart. Please, just let me take my name off that list. I stood by the window of my rented room long after the call ended, the proxy folder still open on the table behind me, the porch light of the building across the street flickering once and steadying again. One signature among the 6 now threatening to unravel everything before the meeting I needed it for had even begun. I called Braylon back within the hour before the fear in his voice had time to settle into something harder to undo. I did not argue with him about the danger. I simply told him the truth, that I still had resources of my own Griffin knew nothing about, and that I would personally guarantee the second loan on his lot through Ronan's office by morning, quietly, with no bank or credit report anywhere near it. He was silent for a long moment on the other end of the line, and I could hear a television playing faintly somewhere behind him. A child's voice asking someone to turn it up. "Why would you do that for me?" he finally asked. "You barely know me, Leonard. I have sold maybe 40 cars a year through your company since you got sick." "Because loyalty that costs a man nothing is not loyalty at all," I said. "And because I do not intend to let Malaysia Walker teach every partner in this county that fear works better than trust. Keep your name on that proxy, Braylon. I will handle the rest." He agreed, his voice steadier now, thanking me twice before I finally managed to end the call, and I hung up the phone with one signature secured again, and considerably less certainty than I let him hear in my own voice about how exactly I was going to make good on that promise before Friday. The emergency board session convened the following morning in the same conference room where Griffin had once presided over quarterly reviews, with his father's old company still bearing his father's old name on the letterhead. 6 board members sat around the table, most of them people Griffin had appointed himself in the last 18 months, along with a sharp-faced attorney representing Vantage Minerals who introduced himself only as counsel and said almost nothing else for the first 20 minutes. Malaysia was not present, though I noticed Griffin checking his phone twice in the first 5 minutes, the screen angled just slightly away from the rest of the table. Ronan stood and formally presented the 6 signed proxies, laying out in plain terms that any vote to finalize the sale of the flagship property required a supermajority that Griffin's shares alone could no longer guarantee once independent franchise votes were factored into the count. He spoke slowly, methodically, the way he always did when he wanted a room to absorb numbers rather than emotion, and I watched 2 of the board members exchange a glance I recognized immediately as the beginning of doubt. "This is sabotage," Griffin said, standing so fast his chair rolled backward and struck the wall behind him with a dull thud that made the woman beside him flinch. "He is manipulating vulnerable business owners who depend on this company for their livelihood. That is exactly the kind of erratic behavior the court already documented 18 months ago." I did not stand. I remained seated, my hands folded on the table in front of me, and let him finish before I spoke. "I am simply exercising rights that belong to those partners," I said. "Rights you apparently forgot they had, the same way you forgot to return their phone calls for a year and a half." The Vantage attorney finally spoke, his voice flat and unhurried, the voice of a man paid by the hour, regardless of outcome, closing his laptop with a small, deliberate click before he continued. "My client's position has not changed," he said. "The offer stands until Friday at close of business. If the sale is not finalized by then, due to internal family disputes or otherwise, the offer is withdrawn permanently, and my client will pursue other opportunities in this region." He said the word family the way another man might say inconvenience a minor obstacle in the way of a transaction that had nothing to do, as far as he was concerned, with anyone's actual life. Griffin's face had gone a mottled, furious red, his composure finally cracking under the weight of the room's silence. "You do not understand what you are doing," he said, looking directly at me now, his voice dropping into something quieter and more dangerous than the shouting a moment before. "There are people involved in this deal who know things about this family that would ruin us both if they ever came out. Dad, people at Vantage who have been watching this company a lot longer than you think. You think you are the only one who knows how to keep a secret in this family? You have no idea what you are standing in the middle of." One of the board members, an older woman near the end of the table, cleared her throat quietly and glanced between us. clearly uncertain whether she had just witnessed a business dispute or something considerably more personal spilling out in front of 6 witnesses and a stranger's attorney. I held Griffin's gaze across the table and said nothing, filing that sentence away exactly the way I had filed away the second listening device Morgan and I found 3 nights earlier, another loose thread in a pattern I was only beginning to fully see. The meeting ended without resolution, the board deadlocked, the Vantage attorney gathering his papers with the same unhurried indifference he had shown the entire time. As the room emptied, Ronan leaned close to me, his voice low, his eyes still on the door where Griffin had just disappeared without another word to either of us. 48 hours, he said. That is all we have left to figure out how you intend to actually stop this. Dr. Yusuf Corona's private practice occupied the top floor of a glass building downtown. The waiting room decorated with abstract art that probably cost more than most of his patients' monthly insurance premiums. A fountain trickling quietly in one corner beside a rack of magazines nobody had ever actually read. Ronan had called ahead using Griffin's name, a small deception I did not particularly enjoy but did not hesitate to use, and it bought us an appointment slot before the receptionist had time to ask too many questions. Corona rose from behind his desk when we walked in, a tanned, silver-haired man in his 50s, whose smile faltered the instant he recognized me instead of the son he had been expecting. Framed diplomas covered the wall behind him, along with a photograph of him shaking hands with someone I did not recognize at what looked like a charity gala. "Who let you in here?" he said, his hand already reaching for the phone on his desk. "I am with a patient. I will need you to leave immediately or I am calling security." "Call them," I said, settling into the chair across from his desk without being invited. "I would love to have a conversation with the state medical board about your finances while we wait for them to arrive." His hand paused over the phone. Ronan stepped forward and set a single sheet of paper on the desk between us. A bank transfer record with certain lines highlighted in yellow. $75,000, he said, wired into an account under the name Escalapius Consulting 3 days before you signed the competency evaluation that put Leonard Hogan into a care facility. The account traces back to a shell entity controlled by Malaysia Walker. Corona did not touch the paper. "That is a legitimate consulting fee," he said, his voice tightening. "Patients pay for privacy. My finances are not evidence of anything." "For what exactly?" I asked, leaning forward. "Consulting on how a man who briefly passed out from low blood sugar becomes legally incompetent within 72 hours. I have read your evaluation, doctor. 2 paragraphs, no follow-up testing, no second opinion requested, no cognitive assessment beyond a 5-minute conversation. You apparently do not even remember well enough to have documented properly." He stood abruptly, color rising in his face. "Get out," he said. "You have no proof of wrongdoing. That evaluation was medically sound. He came into my office confused and disoriented, and I documented what I observed." I did not move from the chair. "Then you will not mind explaining to the board exactly why a routine consultation generated a $75,000 payment 3 days later," I said at my voice level. "Or why the account it came from does not appear anywhere in your normal client billing records, doctor. I have spent 40 years reading balance sheets for a living. I know exactly what an honest fee looks like, and I know exactly what this one looks like." The silence stretched long enough that I could hear the faint hum of the building's ventilation system somewhere above us, and beyond the closed door, the distant murmur of the receptionist answering a phone call that had nothing to do with any of us. Corona's hand, still hovering near the phone, began to tremble slightly. "I have a family," he said finally, his voice dropping, all the polish suddenly gone from it. "A daughter starting medical school in the fall. If this comes out, everything I have built is finished." "It is already finished," I said, not unkindly. "The only question left is whether you finish it honestly, with some chance of leniency, or whether I walk out of this office and hand this record to a journalist by lunchtime." He sank back into his chair slowly, all the earlier bravado draining out of him at once, and reached for a legal pad with a hand that had not fully stopped shaking. "Malaysia came to me herself," he said, not looking up as he began to write. She said your competency was a formality, standing between her husband and a great deal of money. She said it would only take an exaggerated report, nothing anyone could really challenge in court. I told myself it was not really a lie, just an emphasis. I told myself a lot of things that week, actually. That everyone exaggerates a diagnosis somewhere along the way. That you would be well cared for either way. That it would not really change the outcome of your life, only the paperwork surrounding it. I understand now how much I wanted to believe that, and how little of it was actually true. He wrote for several minutes in silence, the pen scratching steadily across the paper, his eyes fixed on the page rather than on either of us. And when he finally finished, he pushed the pad across the desk without meeting my eyes. Ronan picked it up, scanning the confession quickly, his lips moving faintly as he read, then looked at me, and for the first time since we had walked into that glass office, I saw something close to relief settle into his face. The particular relief of a lawyer who has finally been handed the one piece of paper capable of holding an entire case together. "We have enough now, Leonard," he said quietly, folding the confession carefully into his briefcase, alongside the bank record and the proxy folder. "We finally have enough." Corona sat motionless behind his desk as we gathered our things and left, staring down at his own hands, as though they belonged to someone else entirely. And I felt no particular satisfaction watching him, only the quiet, exhausted certainty of a man checking one more box on a very long list before the deadline finally arrived. Ronan drove faster than usual on the way back toward Butte, the confession and the bank record secured in his briefcase on the passenger seat, his mind clearly already several steps ahead into how quickly we could get everything in front of a judge before Friday. He took a curve near the old smelter stacks a little too sharply, and the briefcase tipped sideways, its clasp giving way, spilling a loose fan of papers across the seat and down onto the floor mat. "I am fine, keep driving," I said, reaching down into the footwell to gather the scattered pages before they slid any further under the seat. Most of it was exactly what I expected: copies of Corona's confession, the bank transfer record, a printout of the proxy list Ronan had been carrying since the board meeting. I was halfway through squaring the stack when one page caught beneath my fingers differently than the others. Thicker, glossier. A laboratory letterhead I did not recognize. The paper stock noticeably better than anything else in the folder. The kind of quality reserved for results someone expected to matter for a very long time. It was a paternity test result dated 14 months earlier, the subject line, listing a name I knew and a name I did not. Malaysia Walker. And beneath it, in the same clinical, unhesitating font as everything else on the page, the words, "Probability of paternity, 0%. Tested against a submitted sample labeled only as father." I sat very still, the paper held between two fingers. The car's heater humming faintly against the cold pressing in through the windows. "What is it?" Ronan asked, glancing over briefly before returning his eyes to the dark road ahead. I did not answer him right away. I turned the page over looking for a second name, some indication of who exactly had been tested as the father, but found only a case number and the same lab's return address, a private clinic 2 counties away, that I recognized now as the very address the strange $40,000 transfers had been quietly routed near, month after month, for 18 consecutive months. "This is what she was looking for in that safe," I said finally, my voice low. "Not jewelry, not sentiment, this." Ronan's hands tightened on the wheel. "Leonard," he said carefully, "what does that mean?" I did not tell him what I already understood, not fully, not yet. I understood that somewhere, 14 months ago, before I had even been dragged in front of that judge, Malaysia had already known something about her own son that she needed desperately to keep buried, something worth $40,000 a month to keep quiet. Something that had nothing to do with me or Griffin or the company at all, until the moment it very much did. I thought of Kaysen at the gate, 3 years old, dressed in a stylist shirt, being used as a prop by 2 people who barely seemed to see him as anything else. I thought of a boy who had no say in whatever truth this piece of paper represented, no way to understand it, no fault in any of it whatsoever, and who would carry the weight of it regardless, the way children always inherit the weight of secrets they never asked to be part of, long after the adults who made those secrets have stopped paying any price for them at all. I understood holding that paper in the dark of Ronan's car that I now knew something I could not simply hand over to a journalist or a board of directors alongside everything else. This was not a weapon meant for a boardroom. Using it that way would only ever hurt one person who had done absolutely nothing to deserve it. My own father carried a secret like this once, though. A very different kind. The details of a land deal gone wrong that he never told me the full truth of until I was nearly 40 years old myself, insisting the whole time that some burdens were simply his to carry, so that mine could stay lighter. I used to think that was foolish of him, a kind of stubborn pride dressed up as protection. I understood it considerably better now. Sitting in the passenger seat of Ronan's car with a laboratory report folded against my ribs than I ever had as a younger man listening to him explain it. I folded the paper once carefully and slid it into the inside pocket of my jacket next to the mineral deed next to Catherine's notebook, another secret joining a chest already too full of them. "I do not know yet," I said to Ronan, which was not entirely a lie. He did not push further, sensing correctly that whatever I had just found was not something I intended to discuss on a dark highway at 9 o'clock at night. He returned his full attention to the road, and I sat back against the seat, my hand closing slowly around the old fountain pen, still resting in my breast pocket, the metal, cool and familiar beneath my fingers. Outside the window, the lights of Butte began to rise up out of the darkness ahead of us, scattered and small against the black shoulders of the mountains. I did not speak again for the rest of the drive. I only held the pen, turning it once between my fingers, the way I used to before signing something that mattered, watching the road unspool silently in the headlights. There are some truths that, once known, do not make a man feel any lighter at all. By Friday morning, the flagship showroom had been transformed again, this time into something resembling a courtroom crossed with a stage. Rows of folding chairs faced a long table draped in white cloth, microphones clustered at its center, a banner overhead reading, "A new chapter for Hogan Premier Auto," in letters large enough to photograph from the back row. Regional press filled half the seats already by the time I arrived, cameras mounted on tripods along the sidewall, and a cluster of Vantage Minerals executives stood near the table in dark suits, murmuring quietly among themselves while Griffin adjusted his tie for what must have been the 4th time. Somewhere near the front, I noticed Malaysia had chosen not to attend, her absence conspicuous enough that I wondered how many other people in that room had noticed it too. I slipped in through the same side entrance I had used the night of the launch party, keeping to the back of the room where the shadows still gathered despite the bright television lighting rigged for the occasion. Near the main doors, I caught sight of a familiar face among the hired security detail, older, weathered at the collar, standing with his arms crossed in the same careful posture I remembered from the gate. Luke Bond's eyes found mine across the room, and he gave a single small nod, nothing anyone else would have noticed before returning his attention to the crowd filing in around him. Griffin took his seat at the center of the long table beside the lead Vantage representative, a sharp-featured man named Holloway, who I recognized from the earlier board meeting, his attorney seated just behind him with a leather folder already open. A young assistant placed a heavy fountain pen on the table in front of Griffin, positioned precisely angled for the cameras, the same kind of small theatrical detail Griffin had always cared more about than the substance underneath it. "Ladies and gentlemen," Griffin began, his voice carrying easily through the microphones, warmed by weeks of rehearsal. "Today marks the beginning of an extraordinary new chapter for this company and for this community. The partnership we are formalizing here will bring $42 million of investment into Butte, secure hundreds of jobs, and position Hogan Premier Auto for a future our founders could scarcely have imagined." He reached for the pen. I walked forward before I had fully decided to move, my footsteps carrying clearly across the polished concrete floor, and I watched the room's attention shift toward me in stages. First the people nearest the aisle, then the reporters, then finally Griffin himself, whose hand froze an inch above the pen. "Dad," he said, his voice tightening, instantly his hand still frozen above the pen. "What are you doing? Not here, not today. I'm simply here to make sure this transaction is legally sound before you finish signing away something that was never entirely yours to sell, I said, my voice pitched to carry the way I used to address a room full of skeptical bankers 40 years ago. Griffin's face had already begun to color. "Security," he said sharply, turning toward the doors. "Someone remove him." Nobody moved. I noticed from the corner of my eye that Luke Bond had not so much as shifted his weight. I reached into my jacket and withdrew the folded deed, its edges soft with age, and set it flat on the white tablecloth in front of Holloway, rather than in front of my son. "This is a severed mineral estate recorded in this county in 1958, I said, addressing Holloway directly, now watching his eyes move down to the document. "It reserves in perpetuity all subsurface mineral rights beneath this exact parcel to the original holder of the deed. That holder is not Hogan Premier Auto. It is not my son. It is me." A ripple moved through the seated reporters' pens, suddenly scratching phones angling upward to record. Holloway did not touch the document at first. He simply stared at it, his expression unreadable before finally reaching for the paper and turning it over, examining the county seal stamped along the bottom corner with the careful attention of a man who had seen a great many forged documents in his career and recognized immediately that this was not one of them. Griffin remained frozen at the table, one hand still hovering above the fountain pen he had not yet managed to set back down. His eyes, darting between the document, Holloway's face, and the growing forest of raised phones, now recording every second of his stillness. "Griffin can sell you the surface," I continued, my voice steady, filling the silence Holloway's stillness had created. "He can sell you the buildings, the pavement, every square foot of dirt above ground, but the copper and lithium beneath it, the entire reason your company wants this parcel in the first place, has belonged to me since 3 decades before my son was old enough to sign anything at all. He has been trying to sell you a house with no foundation, Mr. Holloway, and calling it a bargain." Holloway passed the document silently to his attorney, who studied it for a long, tense moment before leaning close to whisper something in Holloway's ear. Whatever he said drained the last of the polite composure from Holloway's face. "This is not what we were told," Holloway said, quietly setting the document down and rising slowly from his chair, his attorney rising beside him in the same motion, already gathering the leather folder and its contents back toward his chest. "Mr. Hogan," he said, addressing Griffin now, his voice cold and final, "we will need to speak privately, immediately. The cameras can wait outside." Holloway did not wait for Griffin's response. He turned his attorney already 2 steps ahead of him and began moving toward the side exit with the brisk, unhurried efficiency of a man who had walked away from far larger disasters than this one and knew exactly how quickly a room like this could turn dangerous for his reputation if he lingered a moment too long. Behind him, several of the seated reporters had already begun murmuring into their own phones, the story writing itself in real time, whether anyone in the room wanted it to or not. "Wait," Griffin said, his voice cracking as he rose from his chair so fast it toppled backward onto the concrete, with a sharp metallic clatter that seemed to echo through the sudden hush of the room. "Wait, we can renegotiate the terms. We can carve the mineral rights out separately. Please, just give me a week. I can fix this. I have fixed worse than this." Holloway did not slow down. The offer was contingent on clean title, he called back over his shoulder, already halfway to the door, his attorney pulling a phone from his pocket without breaking stride. "It no longer exists, Mr. Hogan. I would speak to your attorney about the rest." Griffin spun toward me, and whatever composure had kept him upright through 18 months of lies finally gave way entirely, his face contorting into something I had not seen since he was a small boy, losing a fight he had started himself. "You did this!" he screamed, the microphone still live in front of the abandoned table, carrying his voice out over the stunned crowd of reporters. "You destroyed it! $42 million gone because you could not stand to see me succeed at something. You have wanted me to fail since the day I took this office. Admit it. Admit it in front of all these people." He came around the table fast, faster than I expected from a man who had spent the last several years behind a desk rather than a service counter. His tie already loosened and crooked, And for one instant, I genuinely believed he intended to strike me in front of every camera in that room. He did not reach me. Morgan Green stepped in from the side aisle where he had been standing quietly among the staff for the entire ceremony, catching Griffin mid-stride with both arms and turning the momentum harmlessly into the space beside the overturned chair, instead of into me. His grip firm but careful, the same steady hands he used to steer a stubborn transmission back into alignment. Cameras exploded into motion, dozens of shutters firing at once. Capturing the exact moment, Griffin's face twisted from fury into something closer to humiliation, as Morgan held him firmly by the shoulders. Griffin's polished shoes scraping uselessly against the concrete as he tried and failed to break free. "Let go of me," Griffin snarled, thrashing once against Morgan's grip before going still, seeming to register all at once just how many lenses were pointed directly at him, his chest rising and falling rapidly beneath his rumpled suit jacket. "Easy, Griffin," Morgan said quietly, his voice low enough that only those of us standing closest could hear it clearly. "Not like this. Not in front of all these people." I did not move. I stood exactly where I had been standing since Holloway rose from his chair, the fountain pen abandoned on the white tablecloth between us, still capped, still angled precisely for a photograph that would never be taken. Somewhere behind me, a folding chair creaked as a reporter shifted his weight forward. The banner overhead swayed faintly in the draft from the propped side door, its corner lifting and settling again. I watched my son held upright by a man he had never once bothered to learn the last name of. Watched the flashbulbs continue firing in short, hungry bursts. Watched 18 months of carefully rehearsed control collapse in front of an audience Griffin himself had invited into the room. I said nothing. There was nothing left that needed saying, not with the room already recording every second of it for me. Near the rear of the showroom, past the folding chairs and the tangle of camera cables running along the floor, a side door I recognized as leading toward the old hospitality room swung open briefly, and I caught a flash of a red dress moving quickly through the gap before the door swung shut again. The click of the latch barely audible beneath the ongoing commotion around Griffin and Morgan. Malaysia had been waiting back there the entire ceremony, close enough to monitor everything through the half-open door without ever appearing on a single camera, watching her husband's introduction, his rehearsed remarks about a new chapter, all of it collapsing now into chaos she had almost certainly never planned for. She had chosen deliberately not to sit among the guests where a photograph might later place her too close to the wreckage. With the deal falling apart and her husband restrained in front of half the regional press, she was choosing the only option left available to a woman who had spent years making certain she was never in the room when the consequences finally arrived. I turned my head just in time to see the door swing shut fully behind her. The sound of her heels already fading rapidly down the back corridor, sharp and quick against tile, growing fainter with every step. And I understood, watching that door settle into its frame, that whatever came next was going to require moving considerably faster than I had originally planned. I did not chase after her myself. There was no need to. I caught Morgan's eye across the chaos of overturned chairs. I did not chase after her myself. There was no need to. I caught Morgan's eye across the chaos of overturned chairs and still firing cameras, tilted my head once toward the rear corridor, and watched him understand immediately, releasing his grip on Griffin only once 2 other staff members had moved in to steady him. Then moving quickly toward the back of the building, with a speed that belied his size and the years he had spent standing still under the hood of other people's cars. I followed at my own pace, past the tangle of camera cables, past reporters already shouting questions at each other, rather than at anyone who might actually answer them, past a young assistant crouched on the floor, gathering scattered press releases nobody would ever read now, and reached the back corridor, just as I heard Luke Bond's voice, low and even, coming from somewhere near the loading dock exit. "You are not going anywhere just yet, ma'am," he was saying, standing squarely in front of the propped door, arms crossed, blocking the only clear path to the parking lot beyond. "Sheriff's office is going to want to talk to everyone from this event before they leave. and I would hate for you to have to explain to them later why you were in such a hurry." Malaysia stood frozen a few feet from him, her heels clearly having betrayed her on the gravel outside, one shoe missing its clean polish, now scuffed pale along the toe. Her purse clutched against her chest like a shield rather than a bag. She turned as I approached, and for the first time since I had known her, I watched the performance drop away entirely. No smile, no soft voice for an audience, only the flat, calculating stare of a woman doing arithmetic on how many ways this could still end badly for her. "Luke," I said quietly, "would you walk with us back inside?" He nodded once and fell into step slightly behind Malaysia, close enough to remind her without a single additional word that the door was no longer an option worth considering. We walked back into the building together, Malaysia flanked by Luke Bond Griffin, waiting in the small hospitality room just off the main showroom floor, his tie now hanging loose around his open collar, Morgan standing a careful distance away by the door. The room was quiet in the particular way rooms become once the shouting has finally exhausted itself, replaced by something heavier and more dangerous. A folding table pushed against one wall, still holding a tray of untouched pastries meant for a celebration that had never arrived. I set Ronan's folder on the low table between us. The same folder that had traveled from Corona's office through the spilled contents of that car ride home and opened it slowly to the page bearing Corona's handwritten confession. "Dr. Corona wrote a full confession 3 days ago," I said, addressing Griffin directly. "He admits Malaysia paid him $75,000 to falsify the medical evaluation that got me declared incompetent. Every signature on that court filing was built on a lie the two of you paid for." Griffin's eyes moved to Malaysia, searching her face for a denial she did not offer. "That is a fabrication," Malaysia said quickly, though her voice had lost the steady confidence it usually carried, one hand smoothing her hair back in a gesture that had clearly stopped working on anyone in that room. "He is a disgraced doctor trying to protect himself. Nobody will believe a word he says." The hospitality room door opened again before she finished speaking, and Elena walked in, Beckham's school photograph still visible on the screen of the phone clutched in her hand, as though she had glanced at it once for courage on her way through the parking lot. She had changed out of her work coveralls into something plainer, a simple blouse and jeans, no attempt at all to look like anyone other than exactly who she was. "I believe him," Elena said, her voice steady despite everything. "Because I lived through the same playbook myself, Griffin. The staged hotel room, the photographer paid to be exactly where he needed to be, the manufactured evidence handed to your lawyer within 48 hours. I have spent 2 years understanding exactly how thoroughly this woman is capable of destroying someone's life to get what she wants, and I am done being too afraid to say so out loud." Griffin turned toward her slowly, something flickering across his face that might have been recognition, or might simply have been the particular exhaustion of a man realizing how many separate lies he had been asked to carry at once. "That was different," Griffin said weakly, though he did not sound convinced of it even as he said the words. "That was a private matter between us." "It was never private," Elena said. "It was engineered. The same way this was," she added, nodding toward the folder still open on the table. Griffin's face had gone pale, his mouth opening and then closing again without sound. Some final piece of the story he had told himself for years visibly cracking apart in real time as he looked between the folder, Elena, and the woman standing beside him in a torn stocking and one scuffed shoe. Her arms now crossed tightly over her chest as though she could physically hold the last of her composure in place. He turned slowly toward Malaysia, his eyes searching hers for something that was clearly no longer there, to find some last flicker of the woman he had built his entire remaining life around, and whatever he was looking for, he did not manage to say a single word about it, not one. Standing frozen in that small room with a tray of untouched pastries and the quiet, terrible sound of nobody speaking at all. Nobody moved for what felt like a long time, though I doubt it was more than 10 or 15 seconds by any clock in that room. Griffin stood exactly where he had stopped, his hand half raised toward Malaysia and then lowered again, as though he could not decide whether he still had the right to reach for her at all. The tray of untouched pastries sat between them on the folding table, absurd in its ordinariness, a small domestic detail refusing to acknowledge how thoroughly the room around it had just come apart. "I am sorry to add to this," I said quietly, and I meant it, even knowing what I was about to do. "But there is one more thing you both need to hear before this room empties out, and I would rather you hear it from me now than read it somewhere else later, stripped of any context at all." I reached into my jacket and withdrew the folded laboratory report, the same page that had slid loose from Ronan's briefcase 3 nights earlier on a dark highway outside Butte, and set it on the low table beside Corona's confession, the 2 documents sitting side by side, now like matched pieces of the same broken machine. 14 months ago, someone submitted a paternity sample to a private lab 2 counties over, I said. The result came back 0% probability against the listed father. $40,000 a month has been leaving company accounts ever since, routed near that same clinic, month after month, precisely on schedule, disguised the entire time as a marketing retainer nobody was ever supposed to look at closely enough to question. Griffin's face went a color I had never seen on him before, somewhere between gray and white, and his mouth opened once, twice, forming the beginning of his wife's name without ever quite finding enough air behind it to make a sound. He reached out blindly, one hand landing on the back of a folding chair for balance, his knuckles going white against the metal. "Malaysia," he finally managed, barely a whisper more breath than word. "Tiff, tell me this is not what it looks like. Tell me there is some other explanation, some clinical error, anything." She did not answer him. She stood absolutely still, her arms still crossed over her chest, her eyes fixed somewhere on the middle distance, past his shoulder. And the silence that followed filled the small room completely, pressing into every corner of it, broken only by the faint hum of the building's heating system, and somewhere far off through the wall, the muffled sound of reporters still talking among themselves in the main showroom. The tray of pastries sat untouched between them. A single fluorescent tube overhead flickered, once steadied, went still again. Nobody reached for a chair. Nobody reached for anything at all. I did not fill that silence either. I let it sit exactly as long as it needed to, watching Griffin's whole understanding of the last several years rearrange itself in real time behind his eyes, watching Malaysia's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, the only outward sign that anything was happening behind that carefully composed stillness at all. Ronan appeared in the doorway a moment later, slightly out of breath, a phone still pressed to his ear as he finished a call, and lowered it slowly, glancing between the 3 of us with the particular caution of a man who could tell he had walked into something he had not fully missed. "Leonard," he said, "I just got off with the security contractor. That second device Morgan found in Griffin's office 3 nights ago, it traces back to a technician who was on Vantage Minerals' payroll until 8 months ago, right before he was quietly transferred to a subcontractor with no obvious connection to the company on paper. They have been listening to this company's internal discussions since well before this deal was ever formally proposed. They knew exactly how desperate Griffin was for cash before they ever sat down at that negotiating table, which explains, incidentally, why their opening offer was precisely low enough to be tempting and precisely high enough that nobody would think to question it too closely. Griffin's eyes moved from Ronan to me, some fresh horror dawning across his face, as he began visibly to understand the full shape of what had actually been happening around him for the better part of a year. Layers of manipulation stacked on top of each other from every direction he had trusted least, to suspect his own wife on one side and a corporation pretending at partnership on the other. "They were never going to give me a fair deal," he said slowly, almost to himself, his eyes fixed on some point on the carpet rather than on either of us. "They knew everything before I ever opened my mouth. Every number, every weakness, every reason I would say yes before I even sat down at that table." I looked at Malaysia, still silent, still perfectly composed except for the faint, unmistakable tremor now visible in her clasped hands, her knuckles pale where her fingers pressed together. "Is there anything you would like to say?" I asked her directly. She lifted her chin slightly, met my eyes for exactly one long moment, something calculating, still moving behind her expression even now, some final search for an angle that no longer existed, and said nothing at all. Her silence answered every question in that room more completely than any confession Corona could have written, more completely than any word she might have chosen instead. And Griffin, watching her say nothing, finally understood that too. His shoulders dropping slightly, the last of his composure settling into something quieter and far more permanent than anger. The county sheriff's deputies arrived within the hour, called in initially for crowd control around the abandoned press event, and staying considerably longer once Ronan quietly handed one of them a folder containing Corona's confession, the falsified competency filing, and enough documentation of fraud to keep a financial crimes investigator occupied for months. The reporters who had come expecting a ribbon cutting stayed anyway, sensing correctly that whatever story they left with now would matter considerably more than the one they had originally been assigned. Malaysia was escorted out through the same rear corridor she had tried to disappear through earlier, flanked now by 2 deputies instead of Luke Bond alone. Her composure fully restored by the time she crossed the gravel lot, chin high, eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to grant a single lingering camera the satisfaction of catching her look afraid. Someone had found her a coat from somewhere draped over her shoulders against the cold, an oddly gentle gesture in the middle of an otherwise merciless afternoon. She did not look back at Griffin as they placed her in the back of the cruiser and closed the door. I do not know if that was cruelty or mercy. With Malaysia, I had learned the two were rarely easy to tell apart. Griffin's own attorney arrived not long after, a company lawyer named Osgood I, recognized from years of board meetings, his expression grim as he pulled Griffin aside near the loading dock to explain in the flat, careful language of a man delivering unavoidable news exactly how thoroughly the board would move to strip him of operational control before the week was finished. Falsifying competency filings, concealing material information from franchise partners, failing to disclose a listening device installed by an outside party inside company premises. A litany of violations serious enough that Osgood's primary concern, from what I overheard, was no longer protecting Griffin's position, but limiting his own firm's exposure to what came next. Already speaking in the careful, conditional tense lawyers reserve for clients they expect to lose. I stood apart from all of it near the edge of the lot, where the gravel gave way to cracked asphalt, watching my son's entire adult life dismantle itself in the space of a single afternoon. I felt no satisfaction in it. I want that understood clearly. There is no version of watching your own child unravel that feels like victory, whatever the circumstances that brought it about. The wind had picked up slightly, carrying the smell of diesel from an idling news van, and somewhere behind me I could still hear scattered fragments of reporters filing their stories over the phone. Griffin's name already becoming a headline neither of us would get to write ourselves. Griffin found me there once Osgood finished with him, his shoulders slumped, his tie gone entirely now, his once immaculate suit rumpled and stained, at one knee from where he had apparently sat down hard on the pavement at some point in the last hour. "Dad," he said, his voice raw, the word cracking somewhere in the middle, the way it used to when he was 12 years old and had just been caught in a lie too large for him to talk his way out of. "Please, I know what I did. I know how badly I failed you, failed everyone, but you cannot let them take everything. I have nothing left if this company is gone too. I have nowhere to go tonight, Dad. I do not even know where Malaysia's lawyer is telling her to have me stay away from the house." He came closer, and before I could step back, his hand closed around my sleeve, gripping the fabric the way a drowning man grips anything within reach, his eyes wet and desperate in a way I had genuinely never seen them before, not even as a small boy. "Please," he said again, "help me fix this. Tell them I can still run this place. Tell them I have learned my lesson. I will do anything, Dad. I will start over from the parts counter if that is what it takes. I just cannot lose everything in one single day." I looked down at his hand on my sleeve for a long moment. The same gesture almost exactly that he had used on me the morning I first walked out of that care facility. Except now, the grip carried no threat behind it at all, only fear. Only a desperate, childlike need for the one person who might still be willing to catch him. I thought briefly of every time I had caught him before, the scraped knees, the failed classes, the first business venture that collapsed before he turned 30, each time believing I was teaching him resilience, when perhaps I had only ever been teaching him that consequences were something other people eventually absorbed on his behalf. I reached down and closed my hand gently over his, not to comfort him, only to loosen his grip, and lifted his fingers away from my sleeve, one at a time. Unhurried, deliberate, the way I once taught him to release the clutch on his first car without stalling the engine. "I already taught you everything I know how to teach you, Griffin," I said quietly. "The rest of it you are going to have to learn on your own." He stood there in the gravel lot hand, still hovering in the empty air where my sleeve had been, and said nothing at all as I turned and walked back toward Ronan's car, the sound of the wind and the distant reporters filling the silence I left behind me. 3 weeks later, the flagship office looked almost like itself again. The ring lights and the white backdrop were gone, replaced by a desk I had chosen myself, not the original mahogany, which had disappeared somewhere during Malaysia's renovation and never resurfaced, but a plain oak one that suited the room well enough. Catherine's portrait, cleaned and reframed, hung above a small side table near the window, catching the afternoon light exactly the way it used to, the torn corner of the canvas repaired so carefully that only I would ever know precisely where the damage had been. Elena stood beside me that Friday afternoon as I introduced her to the assembled staff as Chief Operating Officer. Watching her shoulders straighten with something I recognized as pride finally allowed to surface after 2 years spent hiding it. She spoke briefly, thanking nobody in particular, promising only that this company would treat every employee, every franchise partner, and every customer with a fraction of the honesty it had apparently forgotten how to practice. I announced the Hogan Legal Defense Fund immediately after $5 million committed to protecting elderly people from exactly the kind of guardianship fraud that had taken 18 months of my own life, and I watched Morgan Green standing near the back of the small crowd, wipe his eyes with the back of one hand and pretend he had not. My phone buzzed on the desk sometime after the small gathering dispersed, the screen lighting up with an unfamiliar number and a message informing me of a collect call from the state correctional facility. I looked at it for a long moment, the little red light pulsing steadily against the wood grain of my new desk. I let it ring through to nothing. I did not press decline, and I did not press accept. I simply let the light blink itself out on its own 3 times 4 until the screen finally went dark and quiet again. I am not certain that will ever stop being difficult. I want to be honest about that, if only with myself. There is no clean version of watching the phone ring with your own son's voice waiting on the other end of it and choosing deliberately not to hear it. I sat with that discomfort a while, my hand resting flat on the desk beside the phone, and did not try to talk myself out of feeling it. I thought briefly of the way my own father used to go quiet for entire evenings sometimes, never explaining why, and how I had always assumed as a boy that his silence simply meant nothing was wrong. I understood something different about that silence now, sitting in his grandson's restored office with a phone gone dark on the desk in front of me. The knock at my door came 20 minutes later, gentler than any knock that office had heard in months. Elena stood in the doorway, with Beckham beside her, the boy peering curiously past her hip into the room. He had likely never once been allowed inside. "He wanted to see where you work now," Elena said, one hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "I told him he could say hello for a minute." Beckham stepped into the room slowly, eyes moving across the bookshelves, the restored portrait, the window overlooking the lot full of cars gleaming under a clear autumn sky. He stopped in front of my desk and looked up at me, with the particular seriousness only a 9-year-old can manage. "Is this really your office?" he asked. "Elena said it used to be a video studio." "It was for a while," I said. "Now it is just an office again." I reached into my breast pocket past Catherine's notebook and drew out the old fountain pen, the same one I had carried against my chest through every room of this building since the morning I walked out of that care facility. I turned it once in my fingers, feeling the familiar weight of it, then held it out toward him. "This belonged to my father," I said. "He gave it to me when I was about your age and told me a man should always own something worth passing down, not just money, something with his own hands attached to it. I would like you to have it now." Beckham looked at the pen, then up at me, then at his mother, who gave the smallest possible nod of encouragement. "Are you sure?" he asked, taking it carefully with both hands, the way a child takes something he has already decided matters. "I am sure," I said. He turned the pen over once, running a thumb along the worn brass clip, and something in his small, serious face settled into a kind of quiet satisfaction I recognized immediately, because I had felt it myself once, a very long time ago, standing in a kitchen with my own father's hand on my shoulder. Elena caught my eye over the top of his head, and for a moment, neither of us said anything at all, the three of us simply standing together in an office that had spent the better part of 2 years belonging to people who never understood what it was actually for. I did not tell Beckham about the phone call I had let ring through to silence 20 minutes earlier. Some things a 9-year-old does not need carried alongside him. I only watched him slip the pen carefully into his jacket pocket, patting it once through the fabric to make sure it was secure, and thought, not for the first time, that the truest inheritance a man ever leaves behind is rarely the thing everyone else was fighting over. The lot outside my window empties out slowly every evening now, one set of headlights at a time pulling away into the dark, until only the security lamps remain humming quietly over rows of cars nobody is buying tonight. From here, if I stay late enough, I can just make out Elena's taillights turning onto the highway. And once, only once, I caught the small shape of Beckham in the passenger seat, head bent low under the dome light, turning something over and over between his fingers before the car finally disappeared around the bend. For most of my life, I believed a man protects the people he loves by carrying the weight alone, by burying the truth somewhere safe, and never speaking of it until the day it finally has to defend itself. I learned far later than I would have liked that the burying was never really protection at all. It was only a different kind of loneliness, one I had simply grown used to calling strength. What actually held everything together in the end was not the secret I kept for 30 years. It was the moment I finally chose to hand something over in the open to someone who deserved to hold it. I think about that difference often now, the space between guarding a thing and trusting someone with it. Thank God I lived long enough to understand the difference before it was too late to matter. Thank God, too, for the people who stood beside me without asking what was in it for them, because in the end, God willing, that is the only inheritance any of us really get to keep. If you were in my place, would you have stayed silent as long as I did, waiting 30 years for the right moment? Or would you have said the truth out loud the very first day and taken your chances? I would genuinely like to know. Tell me in the comments wherever you are watching from tonight, and if this story found something true in you, stay a while longer. There are more stories like